Hi, St. Mark's. We're finally in the home stretch of this series on English hymns. This week we start in the 19th century. This is a huge century, and it will be divided up into more than one part. At the end of the 18th century, congregational singing in England was in a pretty bad state. In fact, Edward Miller, organist at Doncaster Parish Church, once asked, "If anyone should step into a parish church while the psalm is singing, would he not find the greater part of the congregation totally inattentive, irreverently sitting, talking to each other, taking snuff, winding their watches, or adjusting their apparel?" On the other side of the coin were Methodists, and in their Methodist tabernacles, Miller observed that people were taught to believe that singing praises to God is part of their duty, which they are bound to perform. It is well known that more people are drawn to the tabernacles of Methodists by their attractive harmony than by the doctrine of their preachers. Where Methodists have drawn one person from our communion by their preaching, they have drawn 10 by their music. Miller lived in Yorkshire, where the Methodist movement was particularly strong. In 1790, he issued a collection of congregational songs with one of those extremely long British titles, "The Psalms of David for the Use of Parish Churches," the words selected from the version of Tate and Brady by the Reverend George Hay Drummond, the music selected, adapted, and composed by Edward Miller, Muse Doct. This collection included the classics such as Old Hundredth, the newish Rockingham, as well as tunes from the Methodist movement such as the tune called Messiah, which was an adaptation of Handel's aria, "I Know That My Redeemer Liveth." Most Anglican parishes at the turn of the 19th century adhered to the now centuries-old tradition of singing metrical psalms in church. There were a few places where hymns were sung from time to time, but this was certainly the exception to the rule. Hymns were added to the new version of the Psalter, which, like the old version, were tightly controlled by the Stationers' Company of London. In the 18th century, new copyright laws were enacted, and these laws began to erode the power and the influence of the Stationers' Company. Cambridge University issued its own edition of the new version of the Psalter in the 1780s, including 5 hymns at the end. One of these 5 hymns was written by Charles Wesley, "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," and another was by Philip Doddridge, "My God, thy table now is spread." One of the 5 hymns appended to the new version published at Cambridge is Charles Wesley's "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." Another was Philip Doddridge's "My God, thy table now is spread." Neither Wesley nor Doddridge is given credit in this collection because of prejudices against Methodists and dissenters. In the early 19th century, many collections of metrical psalms and hymns were published, and many of them had the simple title of Psalms and Hymns. Congregation had grown a bit weary and impatient with long metrical psalms, so the publishers created abbreviated versions for their collections. These collections often included 30 to 40 metrical psalms and 10 to 20 hymns. These hymns came from well-known Anglican writers such as Ken, Herbert, Cosin, Newton, and Cowper. They also included occasional hymns by Wesley, Doddridge, Watts, and Steele, but these were included anonymously. Actually, all of them were anonymous at this point because it had not become custom to include hymn writers' names with the hymns. Evangelicals at this time also published collections for their worship, with approximately equal numbers of psalms and hymns. Eventually, the scales would tip, and the number of hymns would outweigh the number of psalms. And Thomas Cotterill published one of these collections with the assistance of James Montgomery. Cotterill was the vicar of a church, and James Montgomery was the editor of a local newspaper in Sheffield, England. Their collection was called A Selection of Psalms and Hymns for Public and Private Use, and it included nearly twice as many hymns as psalms. The church in Sheffield, called St. Paul's, where Cotterill was the vicar, they became embroiled in a battle over this, over hymnody versus metrical psalmody. And this battle was based on two misconceptions. One, the congregation presumed that hymn texts written by humans were inferior to divinely inspired psalms. And two, as I have mentioned in these videos, there was a presumption that metrical psalms were legally mandated in the Church of England, and therefore hymns were illegal. The congregation at St. Paul's brought charges against Cotterill in ecclesiastical court in York on the grounds that this hymnal was illegal. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Church of England structure, the Archbishop of York is the primate of England and is second only to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is primate of all England. In the case of St. Paul's Sheffield against their own vicar, the Archbishop of York declared that there was no case in this matter. Though many had presumed that hymns were illegal, it was discovered that this was simply not the case. In his wisdom, the Archbishop of York decided to resolve the pastoral situation by recommending that Cotterill create a new edition with fewer hymns than psalms, and each hymn should be submitted to the Archbishop for approval. This new edition was called A Selection of Psalms and Hymns for the Use of St. Paul's Church in Sheffield. It was published with the Archbishop's blessing and included a title page allowing wider use outside of just St. Paul's Church. Cotterill's work and travails created a collection of psalms and hymns used widely in the north of England. It was groundbreaking for its extensive hymn section and laid the groundwork for future collections. Whereas the 18th century was most concerned with rationalism and its focus on reason and intellect, the 19th century ushered in a new era of Romanticism, focusing on heroism, individualism, the senses, and the emotions. James Montgomery, that newspaper editor who worked with Cotterill on his collection, created his own collection called Christian Psalmist, which also became a fundamental source for hymnal editors. This collection attempted to present a collection of extant hymns that conformed to the romantic sensibilities of the age and edit out or alter those that were not sensible to the 19th century tastes. 10 of Montgomery's texts are in the hymnal 1982. Here are two examples. Hymn number 93, Angels from the Realms of Glory. Also, hymn 616, Hail to the Lord's Anointed. Reginald Heber's collection called Hymns Written and Adopted to the Weekly Church Service of the Year was one such collection influenced by Montgomery's work. This collection was completed before Cotterill's controversial selection, but the Bishop of London refused to allow it to be published on the grounds that only metrical psalms were allowed in the Church of England. It was published posthumously in 1827, once the air had cleared following the 1819 decision regarding Cotterill's work. Heber's work created a liturgical companion to the services in the Book of Common Prayer, rather than arranging psalms and hymns to fit the liturgical year as early editors had done. Heber's poetic style drew from earlier hymn writers, but his style was unique to his age. 57 of Heber's hymns appeared in his collection, and examples of Heber's hymns include Hymn 301, Bread of the World in Mercy Broken. Heber also wrote what is one of St. Mark's School's favorite hymns to sing, hymn number 362, Holy, Holy, Holy. Heber's collection also included 12 hymns by Harry Mart Milman. One of them is hymn number 156 for Palm Sunday, Ride on in Majesty. Rather than simply being appropriate for a particular day or feast, this is an example of a hymn written specifically for a day. Many have argued that Heber's collection created a title for him, the title of the creator of the modern church hymn book. This hymnal included 1 to 4 hymns for every Sunday or festival in the church year. It also included hymns for special occasions, such as days of thanksgiving, times of distress or danger, after the sermon, before the sacrament, morning, evening, funeral, and other sections as well. His collection also contained 3 translations of Latin hymns. Metrical psalms were distributed throughout the book rather than being in their own special section. If you look in the hymnal 1982, you'll see that the modern American Episcopal hymnal contains many similar sections. By the way, this is a great time to plug the class that I'm teaching. On Wednesdays at 6 p.m., we meet on Zoom, and in the next few weeks, we're going to be covering the hymnal. So if that's interesting to you, I hope you'll join us on Zoom. You'll find a link on social media and in your email. Published around the same time as Heber's collection was John Keeble's The Christian Year, Thoughts in Verse for the Sundays and Holy Days Throughout the Year, 2 volumes. This collection was published anonymously by the professor of poetry at Oxford University. This collection contained only Keeble's words, written over a period of 5 to 10 years. This collection was mostly intended as devotional poetry, but several pieces also worked as hymns, including hymn number 10, New Every Morning is the Love. And there, a very English text is paired with a very American hymn. Another example of Keeble's hymn texts is hymn number 656, Blessed Are the Pure in Heart. Keeble was a product of his time. He reacted against rationalism in favor of feeling, which for him was a divine gift that opened up the possibility of encountering revealed truth. In a series of lectures at Oxford, he referred to poetry as the handmaid of goodness, the means to virtue and piety. Alongside Romanticism, the Oxford movement became a huge force within the Church of England. In a sermon given at the University Church of St. Mary in Oxford on July 14, 1833, John Keeble railed against the secularism that was creeping into British society. This secularism came about because of rational philosophy, pragmatic utilitarianism, and the Industrial Revolution. After railing against a governmental action to suppress 10 dioceses in Ireland, rather than doing the work of the church, Keeble's sermon kicked off what eventually became known as the Oxford movement. John Keeble, John Henry Newman, R.H. Froude, and E.B. Pusey led this reform movement in the Church of England to re-examine its spiritual nature and historical roots. This movement attempted to move the Church of England back toward Roman Catholic doctrine and practice. Members of the Oxford movement published tracts called Tracts for the Times, which led to their nickname, Tractarians. Many of the 90 tracts published by the Tractarians were on liturgical themes. The tracts written by John Henry Newman included English translations of 14 Latin hymns. Newman published a collection of Latin hymns from the Roman and Paris breviaries, which are books that contain the pre-Reformation canonical hours. This collection was called Hymni Ecclesiae. Newman also edited a collection of devotional poetry written by the Tractarians that had appeared in British magazine, Lira Apostolica. Lira Apostolica was a successor to Keeble's Christian Year with one major difference. Keeble's poetry was intended to be personal devotion. Lira Apostolica was anything but personal. Rather, it pushed forward the Oxford movement's ideals. Newman's hymn, Lead Kindly Light, was in the Episcopal hymnals of 1874, 1892, and 1940. Unfortunately, it was cut from the hymnal 1982. But the text is beautiful, so I'm going to read the text for you and play a verse of the hymn. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish day, and, spite of fears, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me, sure it still will lead me on. O'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone. And with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while. And because it's the hymnal 1940, Amen. The only example of Newman's hymn texts in the hymnal 1982 is hymn 446, Praise to the Holiest in the Height. Lira Apostolica had an enormous impact on devotional poetry and hymnody in the period from 1838 to 1950. During this time, more than 70 collections of verse were published with the word Lira. Examples include Lyra Innocentum by Keeble, Lira Catholica by Caswall, Lyra Germanica by a woman, Catherine Winkworth, and Lyra Americana by Ryder. Not to be outdone by what was going on at Oxford, Cambridge University had a parallel movement. And while some argue that a Cambridge movement was distinct, really it was the same movement with same ideals, just on a different campus. John Mason Neal was one of the Cambridge leaders. Neal founded the Ecclesiological Society in 1839, which in a few months would become known as the Cambridge-Camden Society. The society published a journal called The Ecclesiologist, which was originally concerned with church architecture, but soon published articles on liturgy, ritual, and other concerns of the wider Oxford movement. Newman's Latin hymn translation sparked a wider interest of translating Latin hymns into English. These translations were particularly popular in American hymnals. There are 5 examples in the hymnal 1982. The first is hymn number 59 for Advent, Hark, a thrilling voice is sounding. Another example is hymn 127, Earth Has Many a Noble City, for Epiphany. It has a familiar tune also used with an Advent hymn. There's also hymn 257, which we don't sing very often at St. Mark's, because it's for the Feast of the Presentation, February 2nd. The hymn is, O Zion, open wide thy gates. Another example is hymn 311, O Saving Victim, opening wide. Now, as I'll talk in a few minutes, this hymn was originally meant to be sung unaccompanied. So let me sing it for you. O saving victim, opening wide, the gate of heaven to us below. Our foes press on from every side. Thine aid supply, thy strength bestow. Hold on to that one. I'll come back to it in just a minute. And the last example is hymn number 642, Jesus, the Very Thought of Thee. The Camden Society decided to collect these Latin hymn translations into a practical and useful hymnal. New translations were created to fit the meters of the original plainsong melody, such as hymn 311 that I just sang for you a minute ago. John Mason Neal wrote about this new hymnal. In his words, the proposed hymnal will be entirely from ancient sources, The hymns will be taken from those in general use throughout the Western Church before the so-called reform of Urban VIII, 1568 to 1644. And the melody will be that of the best books and the most correct churches, the English being, of course, in the same meter as the Latin. No more alteration will be allowed in the melody than is permitted in the Latin books between the different verses of the same hymn. This hymnal was published in 1851 with the title Hymnal Noted. It included only simple plain chant notation, since the unaccompanied congregational singing was the Camden Society's ideal. A year later, an accompaniment edition was issued due to the overwhelming demand for some assistance with singing these plain song melodies. There are several examples from this hymnal in the hymnal 1982, one of which is perhaps our most favorite Advent hymn, hymn number 56, O Come, Emmanuel. Another Advent hymn in our hymnal that comes from this collection is hymn number 60, Creator of the Stars of Night, which is one of my favorite Advent hymns. Another example is hymn number 82 for Christmas, Of the Father's Love Begotten. You might also know it with the other rhythm. The choir sings a beautiful arrangement of that hymn with the harp for Christmas Eve. And one last example from this collection that we have in the hymnal 1982 is hymn 154, All Glory, Laud, and Honor, for Palm Sunday. The same year that Hymnal Noted was published, John Mason Neal also published more translations of his Latin hymns in his collection called Medieval Hymns and Sequences. We have several examples of this collection in the Hymnal 1982 as well. One is hymn number 3, Now That the Daylight Fills the Skies. This is an example of a Gregorian melody with an accompaniment. Another example is hymn 166, Sing My Tongue the Glorious Battle, also a plain song melody. Also hymn 239, Blessed Feasts of Blessed Martyrs. And another one of my favorites, hymn number 518, Christ has made the sure foundation. And there's also hymn number 624, Jerusalem the Golden. John Mason Neal also published translations of ancient Greek hymns. One of these hymns is one of Father Groff's absolute favorite Christmas carols that is unfortunately not in the hymnal, Good King Wenceslas. So last week I mentioned the parish church at Olney, where the hymns of Newton and Cowper were combined with metrical hymns in the same church and in the same service. The Oxford movement was the exact opposite of this. They were the antithesis of this. This is the sort of thing that they thought should be taken out of the church. Eventually, John Henry Newman and many others of the Oxford movement would leave the Church of England in favor of the Roman Catholic Church. Tracts for the Times ceased to be published in 1841. The name Tractarian was replaced by the term Puseyite after E.B. Pusey, who remained in the Church of England and became sort of the head of the Oxford movement. Puseyite would eventually become known as Anglo-Catholic. These Anglicans became increasingly concerned with Roman Catholic ceremony and doctrine, and they were ridiculed for this by many of their more mainstream contemporaries. E.B. Pusey's brother, Philip, created a hymn paraphrase, which was often sung during this period when Anglo-Catholics were taken to doctrinal court over their beliefs and practices. This hymn comes from the New English Hymnal, and it's hymn number 404. The text is, Lord of our life and God of our salvation, star of our night and hope of every nation, hear and receive thy church's supplication, Lord God Almighty. In the middle verses, you can hear the sort of anguish that the Anglo-Catholics were experiencing at this time. Verse 2 says, See round thine ark the hungry billows curling. See how thy foes their banners are unfurling. Lord, while their darts envenomed they are hurling, thou canst preserve us. And it's set with the tune Iste Confessor, which is one of my favorites, and I don't think we've ever sung it at St. Mark's. So learn it now, and maybe in the future we'll sing it together. And with that, I'll end this week's Music Monday. Next week, we'll pick up here in the middle of the 19th century and move as far forward as I'm able to go before I run into copyright territory. I hope you enjoyed this one, and we'll see you soon.
Uh-oh, you're evaluating my work.
I am.
Are you subscribed?
I will with the red button.
And give us a thumbs up.
I'm a fan, of course.